Hi, you're listening to MEnbar, the podcast of the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. I'm your host, Marc Owen Jones. Thank you for joining us. Today, we're really lucky to be joined by Rory Miller, who's a professor of international politics at Georgetown University in Qatar. But perhaps more importantly, he's also a senior fellow here at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Rory, great to have you here.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Today's episode, we're turning our attention to the security dynamics in the Gulf region, from traditional rivalries and military competition to new emerging threats like cybersecurity, energy security, and proxy conflicts. And we'll also be looking at external actors from Turkey to China to Iran to the US. These all have a big role on shaping the security and political dynamics of the region. More recently, we had the Iranian attack this summer and the Israeli attack. What do these mean for the security situation in the Gulf? What does this mean about GCC security cooperation? What does it mean about the role of the US in the region, which has traditionally been a guarantor of security? These questions and many more will be addressed today, and we're very fortunate to have Rory Miller with us today. So Rory, great to have you here, as I said before. Let's start with a bigger question, or a broad question. What are the biggest security threats facing the Gulf today?
Okay, I mean, this is a question on the mind of all decision makers across the region, in particular in the last few weeks, given what has happened, the things you listed before. What I would say is I would like to reframe it and think of it in a different perspective. What are the security priorities of these actors?
Okay. And you mean the Gulf actors or
the Gulf states?
Yeah, the Gulf states.
Gulf states, absolutely. Which is what I'm going to focus on here.
Yeah.
And I think you could sum it up in two or three ways. And the first is that they're trying to distinguish their identity and protect their identity from outside influence and interference. And they're trying to protect their political and economic autonomy from outside interference. And thirdly, they're trying to build resilience.
Okay.
In other words, they're trying to find ways to make themselves able to deal with and bounce back from shocks more quickly when they occur, and in this region they often occur. So what are the evolving threats, both traditional like military and non-traditional like climate crisis, that are making it harder in terms of their objectives vis-a-vis their identity, their economic and political autonomy, and their resilience building? And in that regard, we're living in an extremely challenging time. And so in those sense, I don't really distinguish between traditional and non-traditional, although obviously we know what these are. The pandemic was a great example of transnational, non-traditional human security threat, and something that countries in this region, like everywhere else, had to address. What I think about is which one of these at any given time is impacting more on their objectives vis-a-vis identity, autonomy, and resilience.
Sorry, not to interrupt, but when you say identity, are you talking about sort of cultural identity, or are you talking about
a very good
political
question.
identity?
I'm talking about how these countries want to be perceived and present themselves vis-a-vis their neighbors, their competitors, their partners.
Okay.
And so this is a hugely important thing. You're in a region where there is a premium on differentiating yourself from others. And like you can trace that to many different aspects of the policies, both domestic and foreign, of these countries, whether it's engagement in sports diplomacy, mediation, and so on. This becomes part of their political and even foreign policy identity, and that's a premium to protect this.
I mean, you mentioned sports diplomacy, you mentioned mediation. I just maybe because it's very contemporary, is the desire to be a mediator after, particularly in Qatar, for example, where we've seen Iran fire missiles, Israel fire missiles, is that in jeopardy?
Okay, this is a big question in the context of what happened recently with the Israeli bombing of Qatar. I don't personally think that this is on the table. In other words, there is serious consideration for ending Qatar's role as a mediator, and I'll say why. The first reason is Qatar is a small state. Yes, it is wealthy. It has significant surplus financial resources from its LNG sales, but it has a limited basket of instruments to achieve its objectives in terms of stopping external interference on political and economic affairs and building resilience. And one thing that they have found to be a very effective way of achieving those objectives is to mediate. They have been very successful mediators. It has built up their reputation. They have been able to demonstrate value to others. And most importantly, it has done something which is that it's been translated into power. And by power, I mean it has helped them have others take their interests into account before they act. So mediation has become an extremely important tool of achieving not just foreign policy contribution, but also of protecting identity and also distinguishing identity.
Yeah.
So no, I don't think it's off the table. The second thing I would say in that regard is, the institutions of mediation have been built. They're there. A huge investment both in human capital and financial investment has been put in, and political capital has been put into this. And this bombing attack, significant as it was, is not going to alter that.
I mean, then, yeah, okay. I mean, it does make me wonder, though, then, if there is a prospect of another military attack. I mean, surely that factors into security consideration. But just in light of the different aspects of security you mentioned, including identity, then, what are the potential threats to those different, I don't know, columns or whatever you call them, for example? What would be a threat to the identity aspect, or what would be considered an actual military threat if that exists?
Okay, so why do actors, whether they're small or middle powers or major powers act? They act to be system effective. They want to have effectiveness when they step outside their borders. Right. And they want to protect what they have built and want to build domestically. So mediation in those terms is a way of being more influential and having others take your interests into account inside your borders, because they value what they do, they respect you, you have legitimacy, you have credibility. So in those terms, the threats to what Qatar wants to achieve are external challenges to its credibility, its legitimacy. And if you leave aside what Israel did, its legitimacy has not been undermined by what happened. Its credibility has not been undermined. You could argue that it's stronger now than it was before in most ways, in terms of its commitment to conflict mediation and conflict resolution, its contribution to stability in the region vis-a-vis what Israel had done to it. The only area where this bombing has undermined Qatar's security, resilience, and identity maybe is in the absence of a immediate or obvious or even likely response, because you don't want to give the impression that you're vulnerable in that regard.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I know you're also an expert in small states, but I mean, Saudi is not a small state. But what about Kuwait, UAE, Bahrain, including Saudi too, Oman? Do you see their threat priorities as different from Qatar? I mean, I presume they share some similar threats, and they also have specific threats to them.
The history of the GCC, which was established in 1981, is the history of these 6 member states trying to grapple with different threat perceptions, different priorities, different domestic audiences and constituencies, all the time knowing that in principle they're better off working together than apart. Right. And that is really the story of the GCC. They are not a homogenous entity. They have diverse security postures and strategies. They've diverse domestic and external needs. So they have not naturally been partners in security, if by security you mean cooperation together to minimize and reduce the threats that they face commonly. So no, they have not excelled in that regard. But what you can see is that while they have had different particular threats, they all share the same interests. So for example, they all want stability in the region, because they all understand that their domestic and economic priorities necessitate that. Right. They all want a good relationship with external actors, because they do not want the Gulf region to become an area of great power conflict, and so on. So they have certain key issues that they share that will push them together. But then they all have their national and natural distinguishing differences that will pull them apart. But that's true of every region. Right. Asia, Europe.
We're seeing it in the EU and
Europe
now, right?
The EU. And what they have missed, that the EU has not, is a cataclysmic event like World War II. Right. That makes them understand that you have to cede some sovereignty to the center in order to be able to be effective, common, cooperative body. And so you could argue that it's been a positive that this hasn't happened, because they haven't had the need like Europe had after World War II. Yeah. Having said that, I do think that what's happened in the last few months has woken up, after many years of, I guess you could say, slumber, this consideration that maybe we are better off working together than apart. And whether that's dealing with climate crisis or rapid and vast changes in the energy sector, or whether it's dealing with Israel that has militarized its differences with a number of countries now and has broken a lot of norms and taboos in terms of going after governments and mediators. I think you're seeing an upward move towards cooperation, but the structural limitations and constraints are still there.
Yeah, I mean, I think then if we, the direction of travel, then it's important to consider, the blockade or Gulf crisis or whatever you want to call it from 2017 to 21, an example of intra-Gulf conflict. And do you see us moving away from a point where that's a likelihood simply because the potential of this existential threat through the bombings is binding people together not just binding them together, but binding the people together in a sort of more meaningful way, long-lasting way?
So I don't think this is an existential threat.
Maybe I should have used it.
No, I mean, some people may do it and more informed than me. Decision makers might, but I don't, because I don't think it runs the risk of undermining the social or political fabric or economic fabric of any of these states. Right. What I think it has reminded them, and this is a really important point, it's been a very big wake-up call for them to question what they consider to be the security architecture of this region since the 1990s. And we can look at that perhaps in a minute. Yeah. But just to get back to your specific question, what I think you're seeing happening now is a realization that in a rapidly changing and unstable environment, self-inflicted damage is not necessarily the way to go. And that's a fundamental change from what we had in 2017 when the blockade starts. And of course, then comes the bigger issue, which is the wider environment is changing, where the US's role is changing.
Yeah, and which brings us to the next point of what role then are external actors? What about Turkey, China, Iran, the US? I mean, these are some of the big powers that are often mentioned as having a lot of influence in the Gulf region. Yeah. What are their priorities? How are they shaping the regional security situation?
Okay, let me start by first principles. I call it what I call this is the middle power dilemma. Okay. You have a number of relatively significant actors in the Middle East and the wider region. But the Turkeys, the Irans, you mentioned them, the Egypts to a certain extent, the Saudi Arabias. And the problem is that what they all agreed on for decades, which was the dominant external actor, the United States, would be the provider of security, is being tested and challenged in many different ways. And we all know those ways, and we can talk about it if you like. The other side of that is, while the dominant actor is no longer as dominant as they were before, none of these actors are able to assert their dominance over the region. Right. And so you have this vacuum created. And in that vacuum is where you see other external actors testing the water, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But these other external actors, whether you talk about China or you talk about Turkey, also have an issue, which is, I exclude Iran here, also have an issue, which is they also relied on America as the dominant external actor providing security. So they're treading carefully. They're taking their opportunities where they come, but they're treading carefully. But I would also say that in those terms, what you're also seeing is that the Gulf states understand that the situation is changing in terms of the US. The US between the early 1990s and the mid-2000s, I mean, arguably until the Iraq War of 2003 and their invasion of Iraq, but even a few years after that, they were seen overwhelmingly, despite differences and issues, as providing stability, security, and order. Now they're seen primarily as providing instability, insecurity, and disorder. But no one in the region can replicate that, and external actors were relying on that stability, security, and order. So it isn't a zero-sum binary situation where America goes down and other actors go up. On certain issues, other actors go up, and on certain issues, this new reality is negative to them in terms of their impact. And then you have the local actors who had been invested heavily politically, economically, financially, militarily in the US security guarantee. And what you start seeing now is something that would have been unthinkable 15 years ago, maybe even 10, which is starting to question the US on multiple issues in multiple ways. But of course, there still is a lack of external actors who can fit in that role. So you have, I would guess you could say, a period of uncertainty, unknown, and wondering what is coming next. But there is no doubt that when you talk about threats and contributing factors to instability, the number one cause of that instability is the uncertainty about the American role going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the uncertainty aspect is really interesting because in a way, there's still, I suppose, a unipolar dynamic, but there is this, like you said, unpredictability, and it's become symbolic of disorder. But at the same time, we still see the presence of US military assets in the region. That hasn't necessarily changed, but it's more like maybe that will change. Is this what's happening? It's this kind of perception that there might be a more substantial shift.
So I like to sum it up like this.
Yeah.
The bottom line, and we can get into the details in a minute, is this. If I call them, will they come? The point is, there's no real substantive evidence, and I think the bombing of Qatar shows this, that if we call them, they will come.
Right.
But there's no alternative to calling them as of now. And I think this is the point. And I think you raise a really interesting point when you raise the military aspect.
Yeah.
Because the assumption up until now was that American power, not just in the Middle East, but across the globe, was a function of economic power, diplomatic power, legitimacy, domestic stability, and military power.
Yeah.
But what you start seeing now in this region, but also in other regions, is increasingly the understanding of American power and contribution to the region is military power.
Yeah.
And so I wouldn't just say the question is, will that be here in the future? I would say, is that enough to provide stability, security, and order? Because there is a huge disparity here between the credibility and the legitimacy and the domestic stability. Right. And why is domestic stability important? Because it's very hard to be an effective foreign policy actor if you're preoccupied with division at home.
No.
And that's why for small state studies, social cohesion is very important.
Yeah.
It allows you to multiply your influence where your other resources may not allow you to do so. But what I'm saying to you is this: the United States militarily are still the only game in town. The question is, does that matter when all the other aspects of power are dwindling?
Well, I mean, I think I can't remember the exact slogan. Is it peace through strength? The rebrandment of the Department of Defense as the Department of War indicates that kind of showing the muscle rather than using, as you said, the tools of legitimacy, even soft power or diplomacy, as means of trying to secure the legitimacy of your presence, which for many people would in many ways be problematic if it was seen as brute force. But they're stripping that away, and it's this kind of image of pure military, pure physical might.
But I also think yes, that's absolutely a correct characterization. But I also think what you see is this: a U.S. decision-making apparatus, and I don't just mean the elected officials, but the leadership of the Pentagon and the State Department, increasingly understanding that as long as these actors rely on us militarily, we're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
But everyone in the region thinking, yes, we're relying on the US militarily, but it's not satisfying or satisfactory, and we will continue to search for alternatives, though not alternatives that are binary, either or, but others in order to make up for the lack of legitimacy, credibility, economic and other contributions.
Yeah.
And I would say one other thing, and I think this is a really important issue. From the US perspective, and I'm not here to speak from their perspective, you definitely see among those who think in military terms that we are stronger than ever in this region. Our position is more solid than ever because our military engagement is bigger than ever. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure that that's enough, and I think you have this real disjuncture between local actors and the US in that regard, and between different branches of the US decision-making elite in that regard.
I mean, it'd be great to talk even in more detail about the US president, but let's move towards intra-GCC cooperation. I mean, what does, not just what's happened recently, but what about the level of security cooperation between GCC states? How's that looking? And, for example, have the recent attacks on Qatar and other events pointed to more cooperation in that regard? Because presumably they are reevaluating even the integrity of the airspace on a very obvious level. But cyber warfare, there's other non-traditional threats that are becoming an important issue. Yeah.
So the GCC was never built as a proactive military actor. It was a defensive regional partnership against external threats. And we all know what those were, going back to the early 80s, the Iran-Iraq War, the Iranian Revolution, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, even the Arab-Israeli Camp David, the Egyptian-Israeli Camp David peace process was seen as a threat to the Gulf states because Egypt was seen as a close partner of Saudi Arabia. Yeah. So it was a defensive, cooperative coalition that came together in a very unstable period. But there was never the trust or the willingness to cede sovereignty that would allow you to be effective in the military domain. There was never any collective security agreements. None of the founding documents of the GCC mentioned the word security. They mentioned cooperation in the economic and the political sphere and the cultural sphere. So the GCC was never conceived as a military or security entity. What happened over the years was, and I think this is to your point, every time a particular threat occurred, they would move closer. We call that an alliance. I work a lot in alliances. They call that the push factor.
Okay.
The Iranians doing great in the Iran-Iraq war in the mid-80s pushed them together. The 9/11 attacks pushed them together. The rise of Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia in the early 2000s pushed them together. The Arab uprisings pushed them together on certain issues. But when those threats rescinded, they would move apart. Going back to what I said earlier, because they are not homogenous. They have different domestic priorities. They have different strategic views on how to deal with issues and what are the consequences of different issues. So it isn't a natural look or to work together on the military, the security front. The second thing I think is that structural. When the GCC was founded, some commentators called it the 1+5 organization, which meant Saudi and 5 others. Right. And there hasn't been a real move away from that on many levels, in part because historically, if not now, when Saudi Arabia talked about security cooperation in the face of outside threats, a lot of local actors thought they meant they're using these outside threats as a way to dominate the region. So this was also another reason to be wary.
I mean, we saw that in 2011, for example, Bahrain, where the GCC Peninsula Shield was deployed into Bahrain. I mean, for many people, that was seen as an affront to use this force as a policing domestic unrest.
Of course. But again, it's also vouches for what I said, which is when threat perception is high, they'll move together.
Exactly.
And when threat perception rescinds, they move apart. But the second thing I would say in this regard is, in terms of the GCC, it still has been quite a meaningful security actor, if not what we understand to be a proactive actor that pools its resources and has a common enemy, because it's been resilient. It's 45 years old now. You know, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the Arab Maghreb Union nearly fell apart. The Arab Cooperation Council, led by Egypt, nearly fell apart because they weren't able to overcome divisions in terms of supporting Saddam and opposing Saddam. But the GCC has kept going through thick and thin. So there are, I'm more of a cup half full commentator on the GCC as a security operator, but you have to understand that they are moving gradually in a way, but that movement may be finite, constrained, and limited. And the second issue I'd say in that regard is, you talked about cyber threats. GCC is happy to cooperate in cyber threats, but they're not happy, like the EU, they're not happy to cooperate in cyber threats to the extent that it has a negative impact on their own freedom of decision making.
Right.
And that's natural in a regional organization. ASEAN is the same, the EU is the same. But the other issue is, and this is where you start seeing perhaps a window of opportunity, if that's the right word, regional organizations and regional groupings that depended on the US as a dominant security provider had no incentive or very little incentive to work together. The EU, we see this now in the context of Ukraine, the GCC. So what you have is the structural challenges have not changed. There are still a lot of issues that will have to be overcome before they can cooperate. I do not think the threats they face now, other than the uncertainty about America, are enough to push them together to be a sustainable military actor if the need arises. But the fact that the US may be voluntarily or not withdrawing from the region, I don't use that word in terms of withdrawing their bases. I mean, intellectually, ideologically, legitimacy terms, reducing their imprint in the region. I think now they may realize that they have to move as far as they can, but it won't be as far as, say, the Saudis want.
Well, what I mean, you know, you're talking about relationship with external actors, and you're talking about individual national priorities within the context of a sort of cooperative unit. But what about the Abraham Accords, for example? Do you think then, based on what you said, it sounds like the UAE, for example, and Bahrain, who have normalized relationships with Israel, will still maintain that unless there is what they perceive as a very direct threat to their own interests. Do you see this being prejudiced by the recent attacks on Qatar?
Yeah, I think it has definitely had a significant impact. Because domestically, these countries have to take account of domestic opinion. They also have to take account of their local allies, their regional allies, allies in the Islamic world. So that's going to have some bearing on their future decision-making vis-a-vis Israel. The other point, of course, is, and I heard someone say this the other day who's more informed on Israel than I am, everyone's talking about whether the Gulf states will abandon the Abraham Accords, but no one's talking whether Israel will abandon the Abraham Accords. Because all of their actions in the last 6 months have demonstrated a complete disregard for their relationships with their Gulf allies. And if you factor in this other point, which is the Abraham Accords were achieved by Israel at no cost. They paid no price. They didn't have to hand over Palestinian land. They didn't have to recognize Palestinian rights. They didn't have to do anything except they asked for peace in return for peace. And that was the basis of that. That was the architecture to bring that together.
And Trump looked good as a result.
And
that
Trump looked good. And it created a domestic, optimism within Israel.
Right.
But my point is there was no cost in that move. And if there had been a significant cost, they wouldn't have gone for it.
The cost might have been, for example, the UAE getting F-35s that never materialized.
Okay. But
that never happened, right?
They didn't get them as of now. Yeah. But not just that. Israel's qualitative edge is still very high vis-a-vis the Gulf states military. But the point is, maybe the issue now is not that whether Bahrain and the UAE will give up on the Abraham Accords, it's whether Israel has given up on the Abraham Accords.
Right.
And that's a very important point. It's becoming more isolated, self-reliant in the sense that it doesn't take into account the preferences or interests of anyone really. And maybe that is done in the water, and that might pose quite a problem for the countries you mentioned, because while I don't think that they are committed significantly to Israel, I think that there was certain areas of technological cooperation and others that they were looking to build on.
I was going to say then, if there was nothing really, if it came at no cost for Israel, what was in it for the Gulf states, right? Like you said.
Well, of course, you mentioned threat.
Yeah.
And the threat ultimately was, if we call America and it doesn't come, we need a cooperative partner who has military muscle in the context of Iran. But the Iranian threat has changed, and also another contributing factor to why Israel may not be as committed to the Abraham Accords as it was in the past, if a cost is attached, I mean, cost-free, of course, but is that Iran is not the threat it was 5 years ago. Right. So the Gulf states are not as important allies in that regard as they were 5 years ago.
Well, and for the Gulf states too, I mean, presumably then, if Iran is not as big a threat, and Iran was certainly mobilized as one of the biggest threats to the region,
of course,
that's changed that consideration surely too, right?
Of course. And that's absolutely the case. Saudi and Iran have come together on a number of levels in the last 3 years that many people thought was not going to happen in the short or medium term.
I mean, moving towards the end, though, do you think there's a possibility there that there could be some form of security cooperation that didn't exist before? Or is Iran still seen as the enemy, but it's better to sort of have a good relationship with this weakened enemy than actually change the dynamic where it could see alliances? So
we've talked about a number of things here, and one of them is that more than ever, the Gulf states are unsure that if we call America, they will come.
Right.
Secondly, American legitimacy and credibility is going down. Thirdly, the Gulf states have learned the lessons of the blockade in terms of self-inflicted damage, and they will want to build regional mechanisms and frameworks that are more effective in achieving their defensive and proactive offensive objectives. But the big problem in terms of what you say is, which is basically enmeshing Iran in the region for the benefit of mutual security, is there are absolutely now no mechanisms or frameworks in existence in this region or the wider region where you can sit down with your competitors, your enemies, your opponents, and talk things out.
Right.
In 2018, the Emir spoke at the Munich Security Conference, and it was the time of Brexit, and he said, for all the problems of the EU, no one imagines that these differences will be settled in any other way than at the negotiating table.
Yeah.
And we need to find those mechanisms. Now, in the intermediate period, you have America holding things together with the security guarantee. But now, as that is becoming questioned, and when I say questioned, I work with militaries a lot. No military is questioning America's commitment to the security of the Gulf militarily in terms of assets on the ground and cooperation, and even in terms of areas like AI.
Yeah.
They're increasing their military AI cooperation. What they're thinking is the legitimacy, the credibility, whether a new administration in 2 or 3 years will even bother or care. So what I'm saying to you is this: where are the mechanisms on the ground that can bring Iran in, discuss things in a way that are sustainable and can lead to compromise solutions. And only after that you can see a security mechanism maybe developing where Iran achieves its ultimate objective for decades, which is regional problems need to be solved by regional actors.
Yeah.
We're nowhere near that yet.
Okay, well, that sounds like we'll have to do another podcast when we're slightly closer to it, which still might be really far away. But let's kind of look forward, the worst part of anyone's job.
Okay.
But do you see you've mentioned it and alluded to other aspects of it, but do you see then greater GCC security integration going forward, or do you see fragmentation?
I see greater integration than exists now, but
It's a low bar.
limited because the fundamental challenges to full integration haven't changed. And that's not even a criticism of the GCC. Look at the EU, a much older organization. Look at ASEAN, which explicitly forbids military cooperation. So the GCC is quite a sophisticated regional mechanism as far as other regional mechanisms go, but that does not mean you're going to see full military integration. What you will start seeing now is more cooperation in terms of training, sharing intelligence, working together with other allies. Oman, for example, undertakes maritime exercises with China, Russia, and Iran on an annual basis.
Yeah.
So you're going to see this sort of thing, and it can only ultimately lead to closer cooperation. One of the things people forget is one of the main reasons that America is so confident on the military level of future influence and dominance in this region is it has generational relationships with the military. And they cannot be replicated quickly, even if a China or a Russia has the political will to do so.
When you say generational, is that almost personalistic? We're not just talking about equipment.
Totally.
But this is like the fact that
Totally.
American presence, it's about personal
Not
relations,
just
about equipment,
American-
training.
Not
everything.
just the American presence,
Yeah.
but, and you see this in Europe too, all we ever know is that we got our intelligence off the US.
Yeah.
We got our training off the US.
Right.
Our officers went as young officers who are now leading the militaries, trained in the US,
Yeah.
worked in the US, grew up with their
Right.
counterparts in the US.
Right.
Now, this is not just limited to the military.
No, of course.
You know, I've heard senior energy officials talk about how they grew up and built Qatar Energy together with the Rex Tillersons of this world.
Right,
And so this personal aspect has no other actor has come close to replicating that in this region, because no other actor has had the access and influence in this region, in the security realm, that the US has. And that does not go away. Even if tomorrow the US said, we're out of here, which will not happen, it would take 15 years for any other actor who really wanted it, and they may not want it, to get to where the Americans are now.
Rory, is there anything you'd like to add that I haven't asked or that you'd want to say before we
No,
wrap up?
I mean, you know, I would just say one thing, and I think I like to conceptualize security in the Gulf in one way. All of these countries, and they've been very successful in certain areas like energy and developing their brands in different ways, but all of them are vulnerable to a very challenging regional environment. And what you need to think about is this: how do we draw on our available resources? And they can be material, they can be immaterial, they can be intangible, to minimize those vulnerabilities. And the ways that they are doing it, and we can look at this, think about Trump's visit to the Gulf in May of 2025. The way they're doing it is like this. Smartly locating ourselves strategically between all these different actors. Demonstrating our value so that they take into account our needs when we need them. Sell a narrative of our value to you. And like, I find it's a fascinating, if you look at the blockade, if you look at the relationship with the US, these countries have become very good at selling a narrative. What is our value to you? Some people criticize the Gulf, say, oh, they just use their money to buy a narrative, but they actually sell a narrative fantastically in the security realm. And so I think when you think about why they mediate, why they do sports, diplomacy, why they contribute to climate crisis initiatives, they are thinking, how do we locate ourselves smartly on this issue? How do we demonstrate value, and how do we sell a narrative? And this is what they're doing in the security realm every day.
Professor Miller, always in education. You've been listening to Rory Miller, who's a professor of international politics at Georgetown University here in Qatar. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the ME Council. You've been listening to Marc Owen Jones. I'm the host of MEnbar, the podcast for the Middle East Council on Global Affairs. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.